Margaret, last Ceann Corla, and Minister, good luck to you in your campaign for leadership of the Green Party. I just want to start by quoting from the Library and Research Services in the Oireachtas and the Bills Digest that they gave us on this. It's very useful. They talk about Childminding Ireland report that was published on the 10th of June, its annual survey of childminders. And that states that a consistent theme which emerged was that childminders find bureaucracy frustrating and tiresome and fail to see what benefits the rules and regulations bring. And specifically, the results of the survey show an increase in the number of childminders who are concerned with the incoming changes and the regulations that are to be introduced. There's a sense of insecurity about what the future will bring to this sector. And it should be a major source of concern that there is a relatively low number of people who see themselves being in this sector in 3 years' time. And the graph that is given is indeed very interesting. When asked, do you intend to register with TUSLA under the new regulations, 18.2% said yes, 30.7% said no, and 51.1% said they don't know. And if you were to allow for even half of that 51.1% going both ways, to no and to yes, you would have more than half of the total childminder sector coming out of the business, according to this survey. The second one they show is, do you intend to offer the National Childcare Scheme when the register opens? And again, 18.2% said yes, 6.5% said no, and a big number said don't know, 44.8%. So I think what the conclusion is that there is a major source of concern that there'll be a relatively low number of people seeing themselves in this sector in 3 years' time is actually borne out by the survey. However, it remains to be seen where this will go, and it remains to be seen how much the Minister will listen to those who are writing in to all of us with grave concerns about the future of the sector. And I have written to you, Minister, and suggested that the proposed draft of the regulations presents a further bureaucratisation of a system that is already onerous for parents and for the service providers. Childminders continually report that regulations are too extreme, will drive them out of childminding, and that in turn creates a further dearth of places for desperate parents who are already facing difficulties in securing care for their children, with an overly elaborate and cumbersome process that parents and service providers have to navigate in order to work within the current childcare model. And that's really unfortunate, because not only does it put the childcarers out of business, potentially put them out of business within 3 years, but it'll force a lot of parents out of their jobs as well, precisely because they can't afford to or get the childcare that suits them. I just want to read some sentences from letters I received. It's not the letters in their entirety, but I think they kind of give a flavour for the concerns about this bill and about the intentions of the Minister and what we might see come out of the other end. The first letter: I've been working as a childminder in Wicklow Town for the last 15 years. I'm extremely concerned about the lack of understanding about what childminding is in these proposed regulations, and about the negative impact that the proposals will have on my individual service and on other childminder services. Many of the childminders that I am in contact with are considering ceasing trading if the regulations do not reflect the unique care that childminding is, that is, a home away from home. We need to get this regulation right for the sake of the current and the future children that are minded by child carers, and for childminding to continue to be a flexible and loving home away from home option for parents. And that's some of the contents of one of the letters. The second one I want to read from says, I'm a passionate childcare provider, and I provide a loving and fun home away from home environment for the children I mind. I welcome the idea of regulating and recognising the work that childminders do, both for the sake of the families and the children that avail of our services, and for ourselves that provide the services. But when I finally got to read the draft Childcare Act of 1991, Early Years of Services Childminding Regulation 2024, I was very disappointed. We childminders were told that the regulations would be specific for childminders, but these proposed regulations are not. I am not an early year service provider, and I am not working on a premises. I am a childminder and I work in my home. I feel the draft regulations are written to change childminding and not to nurture it. The childminder or the children we mind are not at the core of these regulations. The flexibility and care that childminders provide to families is not supported by these regulations. It has taken 2.5 years to write these regulations, and they remain as vague and unclear as they can be. The things that childminders express most concern about at the start of the process, education needs, nature of inspection of our homes, administration, the paperwork, etc., have not been defined, but instead have been left to be decided on after the legislation has been passed. We are not early year services, we are childminders and need to be defined and regulated separately to the current Childcare Act of 1991. And I've had a look through the regulations and what she and others are referring to, and it is really heavy bananas in terms of bureaucratisation of the sector. There's sections on training, assessment of suitability, the maximum number of children that childminders can mind, and some of them make the point that childminders are the cornerstone of baby minding. And it is very frequent that babies are put into this sector to be minded by neighbours or parents or family members of some sort or another. And it's in the home setting. And all homes are different. A bigger house doesn't necessarily mean better care. A posher house or a more accessible house doesn't necessarily mean better care. There's elements of this on supervision, on food and drink, insurance, registration, keeping records on children, notification of incidents, inspection, enforcement and execution, and legal irregularities. Now, I understand there may be ultimately a reason for all of this, and that it's a child-centred act and it's meant to protect the children and the provision of care that they receive, etc., etc. But I want to make this argument to you, Minister, that in the absence of a fully publicly run childcare service from cradle to up to 18 years of age, schools are publicly run. We would not send our kids from the age of 5 and 6 into a mishmash of private type sector that educates them from the time they're 4, 5, 6 up till the time they're 18. That's publicly run, and so it should be. But why are the early years and the childminding from babies onwards privately run, and therefore left with all of these regulations, different cumbersome and bureaucratic mechanisms that parents and childminders have to go through? And often, in the absence of a publicly run service, whether it's for children or for elderly people, more casual and relaxed, informal arrangements will exist between people. And by the way, mostly in working class areas, in areas where people have lower incomes, are poorer, and will depend on each other, but depend on neighbours and depend on families more. And I want to compare it, in the last minute or so, I want to compare it to the home help services. Before we were ever in the Dáil, we took part in a campaign with home help providers all over our constituencies. So when I say we, I mean people before profit. A big part of that campaign was working with home help providers, many of whom were my neighbours whom I watched go out every day to look after other neighbours, to clean their house, to help them with their medication, to collect their pension, to buy their messages. Neighbours who knew each other, who trusted each other, and neighbours who at the end of the week would pick up a few bob from usually a HSE-run office for minding other neighbours. That was all torn apart on the basis of regulating the industry. And all of the type of literature that I read out there, regulations, health and safety, training, accountability, that all came into play. And it came into play so much that at the end of the day, a huge amount of neighbours left that job. And now today we find ourselves with a fully privatised care sector for the elderly, which is not fit for purpose, which is why people are left in hospitals being called bed blockers, because we can't send them home, because they don't have the home help service to look after them, and the private service is not up to scratch and is not available. So I think it's a real tragedy not to see that the casualisation of services that are not publicly provided often serves working class areas the best. And it is working class people, the poorest, who will be hit the hardest if we don't get this right. So we're asking you, Minister, to listen to the sector, to look at the regulations and not make them so overly cumbersome and such a burden that many people, more than half of them, will pull out of providing those services within 3 years, ultimately impact worse on the parents and those workers that we need in the workplace.